Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our session this afternoon on COVID-19 and the Global Refugee and Migration Compact. I was about to say it's great to see so many of you here today, but it wouldn't be quite truthful to say so because I don't see the 570 participants that we have registered, but only about 5 people in the room with me here in Copenhagen today, for the very reason that also covers our topic today. We organize this as a long-distance event. It gives us limitations, and it would have been enjoyable to be together and to be able to see each other whilst we have this session. On the other hand, it means there are certain things we can do more easily. We can pull in people from different corners of the world, and you will find, I'm sure, that we have pulled in high-level discussions along the way. And also it means that your questions and your participation can be brought up whenever it suits you. The model for that, or the modality for that, is the Q&A section that you will find if you look at the panel function. There's also a chat function if you open the panel, and that's for technical issues that you may want to see clarified. So I'm hoping now that you can open that chat function and that technical issues will not impede you from opening the very function meant to solve them. Anyway, Q&A section, questions. Chat function, technical issues. Now, the purpose of our session today is to present the findings of 2 studies. One on the Global Compact for Refugees. I'm going to call it the Refugee Compact, and the other one the Migration Compact. Also, the purpose is to discuss with you how we best ensure that those 2 compacts are brought to use. We shall touch upon issues such as, have we lost momentum, and for us to make the most of these instruments, what is required in terms of leadership and advocacy. The program ahead of us involves a presentation of firstly the migration study, followed by reflections and a discussion. Then we have the refugee study, followed by reflections and a Q&A session. And then we try to merge the 2 perspectives and bring the discussions together in a plenary debate. And so that's the essence of the program ahead of us for the next 90 minutes, hour and a half, finished by 3:30 Central European time. Now, before we go any further into the actual program, it is my pleasure to hand over the floor to the representatives from the Mixed Migration Center and Danish Refugee Council who have organized this event jointly. And first of all, I hand you over in the capable hands of Malte Mulvad from the Danish Refugee Council, and he's with me in the room. So Malte will take over my seat for a few opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Werner. I'd just like, my name is Malte Mulvad. I'm heading the External Relations Secretariat at the DRC headquarters, where we've engaged on the Global Compact on Refugees for a number of years now. So on behalf of DRC, I would like to warmly thank the presenters today, the discussants, as well as the many, many participants that have registered for today. I would also like to thank all the contributors and informants on the 2 reports, and finally, of course, thanking Werner Christiansen for taking us through this afternoon. So the COVID-19 pandemic has had significant consequences for displacement affected populations. So while we as DRC have been adjusting our responses, we had from the outset a focus on the longer term effects of COVID-19 on displaced people. And that be it the economic, the social and economic consequences, but of course also the protection consequences of the pandemic. This has been reflected in DRC's COVID-19 appeal, and where both our operational response and our advocacy has mainly been focusing on these longer term effects. So with this in mind, it's obvious to look at the most recent international framework for forced displacement, namely the Global Compact on Refugees, and the consequences of COVID-19 on its implementation. But it's also interesting to look at the potentials of the compact in addressing the challenges of COVID-19 for refugees. I remember personally being at the Global Refugee Forum in December 2019, and with some cautious optimism observing how notably responsibility sharing, inclusion, and self-reliance really came to the forefront. But of course, also very aware of the challenges of implementation and actually wondering how many refugees are going to have positive protection outcomes because of the Global Compact on Refugees. However, I guess few people expected that a few months later, the whole foundations would be upturned by a pandemic, and that some of the preconditions on refugee protection, such as self-reliance, the possibility of self-reliance, asylum access, movement restrictions, and service access, as well as extraordinary negative economic consequences would be upon us. So therefore, DRC has commissioned a study on the impact of COVID-19 on the GCR, which is a logical consequence of, as I mentioned, our continued engagement on the compact back from the New York Declaration 2016. We, in general, feel also that the Global Compact on Migration and Global Compact on Refugees needs to be seen in a complementary way. So this joint event and our joint research with MMC is a reflection of this. So with those few words, I would just say I look very much forward to the presentations, to the discussion and the debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Malte. Now, this was the part that was almost like a real conference or seminar where one person moves to the stage and is replaced by someone else. Now we move back into the virtual sphere as I hand you over to the head of the Mixed Migration Center, speaking to us from Geneva, Bram Frausch, please.
Thank you very much, and also welcome everyone on behalf of the Mixed Migration Center. Thank you very much to all the participants for joining us for this interesting webinar today. I think we have a great lineup of speakers and discussants. And I would also like to echo the words of appreciation that Malte just expressed. Like Malte, I'll also keep it very short. Why did we as MMC conduct this or commission this study on the Global Compact for migration and COVID-19? First of all, because we as MMC believe strongly in the GCM. And we think it is important to keep the momentum on this important compact going. That is also why 1 year ago we did a first global stock taking of implementation after 1 year since the adoption of the Migration Compact. And we presented these findings in a report called Wheels in Motion. At the beginning of this year in January, when many of us were in Quito for the Global Forum on Migration and Development, and where we spoke about the GCM, I presented this study, and we all said 2020 is going to be a crucial year for GCM implementation. Well, little did we know about 2020 back in January, because then came the COVID-19 crisis and the accompanying protection and economic crisis for people on the move. And as MMC, we have interviewed since March more than 12,000 refugees and migrants about the impact of COVID-19 on their lives. So we have been hearing every day how these different crises are affecting refugees and migrants all over the world. And the Global Compact for Migration includes many provisions for how to respond to these crises. And in a way, in fact, the Migration or the Migration Compact itself was born out of the so-called migration crisis. So in this crucial year for the GCM, even more crucial than anyone could have thought at the beginning of the year, we wanted to know two things, basically. One, how is the GCM being used to respond to this crisis? Is it proving to be fit for purpose? And two, what will be the impact of the crisis on GCM implementation itself? I must say I started out with quite modest expectations because I didn't see much reference to the GCM in early statements or responses to the pandemic. But I must also say I was quite positively surprised when I read the first draft of the report. And I think both the title of our study and also the quote that you will find on the first page will speak to that quite positive reflection. So without saying much more, I just want to end with saying that we've been very lucky to have John Bingham on board to conduct this study for us, as I couldn't think of anyone better placed to do this study. And he will present the outcomes today. So with that, I would like to wish you all an excellent webinar. Thank you very much. Enjoy, and I'll give it back to the moderator. Thank you.
Bram, thank you very much. And Malte, thank you very much for those opening remarks that set the stage for our discussion and why this seminar has been organized. So essentially, we have now half an hour on the Migration Compact followed by half an hour on the Refugee Compact, and then we have a discussion of the two afterwards. Our first presenter is the author of the study on the Migration Compact and how it is affected by COVID-19, John Bingham. John works with the Global Forum on Migration and Development Business Mechanism, and he's thematic lead on gaps in migration protection. And so as we heard Bram point out, one of the leading experts in this area. And when I read through the study, I stumbled across in the introductory remarks, the energy around the compact continues to be positive, but scattered in the whirlwind of COVID time is the words used. So to hear more about what that whirlwind has involved, John Bingham is going to talk to us for 15 minutes. After John's presentation, we're going to hear Jonathan Prentice, Head of Secretary at the United Nations Network on Migration, comment on John's presentation. But to set the scene for the migration study, John Bingham, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Malte. Good day, everyone. I'm happy to be with you, grateful to the Danish Refugee Council, and in particular, Bram Fruus, Roberta Farin, and the All-Stars at the Mixed Migration Center in Geneva. I'm honored to present this study they asked me to do alongside Evan Easton Calabria and her report, joined for expertise and insight by Jonathan Prentice, Gronya O'Hara, and Wies Maas, the great Wies Maas. Well, COVID and the Compact for Migration. No one would have guessed that when the UN member states so overwhelmingly agreed that the Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration would take a 360 degrees approach, that 360 degrees really meant how brutally hot all sorts of things were going to get for migrants of all kinds and all people globally just 12 months later. Nor when the member states insisted on a whole of society approach did anyone imagine the depth and the width of the hole we were all going to fall in, with not one but three COVID-related crises, as Bram just mentioned. First, the pandemic, then immediately the economic crisis, together bringing the third crisis, what UN Secretary General Guterres calls, and we all know to be, the protection crisis, all fully global. Kidding aside, the suffering of people worldwide, and disproportionately people on the move and across borders, the suffering has been epic. One wave in, almost a year on, a second wave cresting, with a meeting of the International Monetary Fund just this week suggesting that local transmission might well continue until the end of 2022. So if you would allow a brief moment of quiet is in order for a proper thought and respect as we begin, for those in pain and trouble, and for all responding. Now, the study I did was not original. It was reporting on the basis of interviews and inputs predominantly of 34 people on the front lines of response to migrants of all kinds in COVID-related circumstances, including refugees and diaspora. I spoke with officials of states, cities, and intergovernmental entities, international organizations, business, and civil society. Of the 34, 21 themselves were current or former migrants and refugees. Anything interesting in my study comes from them. Anything not is my bad listening, or then just 5 of the principal findings and recommendations. First, as Malte referred to just a moment ago, the energy around the Compact for Migration continues to be positive but scattered in the whirlwinds of COVID time. Who positive? States most concerned with their people abroad, of course, are most vocal, as is very much the UN Network for Migration, and civil society broadly, though there is a sizable disconnect between the expressed energy and engagement of those at global levels and those at national. Business and city leaders, however, have been something of a surprise, bringing fresh energy, high expectations, and healthy impatience for implementation of the Global Compact. Why scattered? Because COVID is the great scatterer. As Evan's report notes regarding the Refugee Compact too, most of those I interviewed for the Migration Compact study were immediate in saying, these crises have demanded full-time, full-scale attention and energy. People, organizations, and authorities are simply and totally occupied with doing. Second, nonetheless, many among those consulted for this study expressed concern, even alarm, at the mix of hesitation and distraction that is impeding many states and other actors from expressly referencing the compact, even as they act in ways that clearly correspond to it. I know that Evan's report has observed likewise with respect to the compact on refugees. Again and again, people across all the groups I spoke with complained of surprising shyness about the Migration Compact in official reports or conclusions, even some among top officials and processes of the UN and states, as well as from civil society, other than some of the big coalitions, most notably the Civil Society Action Committee and the NGO Committee on Migration New York. Some say the shyness comes from political caution, given negativity towards the compact of a small number of state heavyweights. But the largest convergence among people interviewed is that the shyness is primarily because the compact is still relatively new, that there is almost always a slowness in the pickup of reference to new international frameworks. Actors are simply not that fluent yet, either in the compact itself or in its essence as a menu of solutions. In fact, several emphasized how important it is to remember what a leap this particular compact was. Unlike the Compact on Refugees, the Migration Compact has no widely ratified international convention as a comprehensive foundation, nor an established regime for complementary governance. If anything, the long history of migration governance was that even its mention could start a fight in an empty bar. Third, it's widely believed that it is imperative to connect and cite the compact when concrete action implements it. Now, for some reason, there's much debate on whether actors should cite the compact before they act or after they act. To be clear, linking to and reporting actions under the compact is a priority that accompanies, not precedes action. In many cases, the regional review processes beginning this month and continuing through March will do this. Indeed, many countries are in full preparation of their reports, some of them in consultations with non-state stakeholders, including business actors, and even some states that did not vote for the compact. Fourth, the real measure of the compact. The real measure of the compact and the effect of the COVID-related crises on the compact is achieving change on the ground for real people, for communities and countries. This is really the heart of my report's findings and recommendations. Because the value and the most credible evidence of the value of the Compact for Migration is in whether the actions of the compact, 189 actions just under the 23 commitments that the states agreed upon in the compact, are they taking place? That is, for all the talk of whether this or that actor is mentioning the compact wants action, not mention. It's a nice problem to have, no? To actually see action first and then worry about mention afterwards. In fact, almost everyone I spoke with expressed some amazement at the scale and nature of action that states in particular have taken in COVID time that matches and in some aspects even exceeds action that they committed to in the Compact for Migration. Among notable concrete examples, in many places, the widening range of regularizations, most for workers considered essential across the fields of healthcare, both in institutions and at home, farm work and meat packing, food distribution and sales, transportation and construction. Slow but increasing recognition of migrants as creators of jobs and of businesses and of their earnings, including action to ensure payment of wages for work performed and to formally designate essential the processes for transfer of remittances, access to health care and other public services without fear of reprisal, alternatives to detention on the basis of immigration status alone. Many of these long fought for over many years in many processes with many UN agencies, and very much also in the lead, put into the Global Compact after much hard negotiation, and now we see it in COVID time, here and there and more and more. There's a table in the study that presents just a sampling, not a full mapping, of these and other current actions for change on the ground around the world. Many told me that these actions, all this action that corresponds to actions in the Migration Compact, actually prove the value of and will inevitably strengthen the relevance and use of the Compact in the best way possible by doing it. There's no spin there. Now, to be clear, none of this is to deny widespread examples of actions in exactly the opposite directions also. Finally, to underscore what everyone is looking for, especially in COVID time, solutions. Despite what a tiny minority of states and extremists have said, and will continue to say, the Compact was not developed to create new rights or overrun national sovereignty. The Compact was created for solutions, to collect practices, to recommit to principles and partnership, and be concrete on change. Born in a regional crisis in 2015, now confronting not one but three crises fully global, the Compact offers its menu of solutions to a world desperately looking for that. Like those I described a moment ago, the solutions are actions where they fit, one at a time. Looking at them together, however, it's clear that migrants are not just objects of the solutions, they are key actors in the solutions. The new word for migrants, essential, is not ambiguous. Consider the change in narrative there, that seeing migrants as part of solutions could signal a paradigm shift in public perceptions and narratives on migration. Consider further the question, as many of those I interviewed did, if migrants across their wide diversity are part of the solutions in the crises as essential workers, as earners, consumers, senders of remittances, as creators of jobs and businesses, are they also part of the solutions for recovery from the crises? Many said that that should be clear, but needs to be made more clear. And it calls for making permanent many of the actions that correspond to the Compact that have been implemented temporarily in COVID time. To close, the question in the subtitle of the study I did, is a Compact born in a crisis, born again in the whirlwinds of 3 global crises, without denying the epic challenges, some slow starts, and mighty reversals? The answer is yes. What I heard people say is that not everywhere, but in many places, this compact is actually being adopted again, this time on the ground, again and again and again in COVID time. Thank you.
John Bingham, thank you very much for going through the three dimensions of crisis that your report covers. Excellent, very interesting, lots of things to discuss. And just to remind participants, the way to let your question or your particular interest be known is to go to the panel to the right of your screen, look under Q&A, and then put your question in writing whenever it suits you. We will have to wait another few minutes before we get to that, because the first discussant to respond to John's presentation of the study is Jonathan Prentice, who's with us. He's head of secretariat of the UN Network on Migration, a network established to assist member states of the United Nations implement the Global Compact on Migration. So, Jonathan, let's hear from you. John was referring to surprising shyness. Let's hear what surprised you the most in his account of the findings that he had reached. Jonathan Prentice, please.
Thank you very much, Werner, and thank you very much to the Danish Refugee Council and the Mixed Migration Centre for putting this important event on, and for inviting me to make a few comments. I'm not going to be so presumptuous as to comment on John's report or his presentation of it. I think both are excellent and really valuable contributions to this debate, not simply because they were very favourable on the network for which I work. But I am going to amplify a few points, if I may. And I think the test of a framework, any framework, can be measured in a number of ways. There's its longevity. Does it have legs? Obviously, in the case of the Migration Compact, it's a little too early to say. There's the extent to which it becomes a reference point. John has touched on that. There's the extent to which it's implemented, related to being a reference point, but also somewhat different. And again, I think these are points that John has covered to a large extent. There's also, I think, whether it has good fortune. And I think there's an interesting counterfactual here as to whether we would have had a global compact on migration if COVID had materialized in 2017 or 2018 or 2016, very recently in the near past, whether it would have had deep enough roots to have withheld the vast, genuine distraction, oxygen suck that COVID represents if COVID had materialized last year. I know certainly for the network and the new way of working in the UN system, I would have had serious worries about our ability to withstand these buffets if COVID had appeared just 12 months earlier than it did. And then I think you can measure the relevance of a framework by its ability to not just withstand a crisis, but to shine through it as a tool of relevance. And John, in his presentation and in his paper, makes very clear, and I agree with him, that not only was the compact born out of a crisis, though I would add here a very significant rider, that the crisis out of which it was born was overblown, almost manufactured, and geographically very self-absorbed. But it is now being baptized in a new multi-dimensional crisis, and the report refers to the three of those. I think it misses one of the most important elements of this crisis, which is a crisis of confidence. We have a political crisis of confidence in many states. We have a geopolitical crisis of confidence. An institutional one. This has happened when confidence in our institutions is not shall we say, riding high, and there's an economic crisis. And I think this has the potential to be the most profound and the most damaging, much further, on a much broader agenda than the migration agenda, but certainly incorporating that agenda as we move forward. But of course, as John mentioned, and I would endorse, there is much, I think, to feel positive about as regards the relevance and the amplified relevance of the Global Compact on migration in this current context. He mentioned a number of ways in which we are seeing an acceleration of positive trends that I suspect wouldn't have been so evident absent the pandemic. I just also would like to mention, because I don't think John may have done in his oral comments, the issues around regularization and alternatives to detention on the basis of immigration status, where I think we're seeing progress that is extremely welcome. And again, I would just like to reiterate that none of this offsets the extremely alarming, extremely distressing, negative impacts that responding to COVID or creating a pretext of responding to COVID has generated for those in vulnerable situations. So that would be one positive aspect. A second is we have a much stronger sense of what the implementation of the Global Compact could look like. It's such a broad, expansive document that actually distilling down into concrete illustrations what GCM implementation can look like was curiously complex question to answer. Straightforward question, difficult to answer. And I think through a number of strands of work, and I would highlight here the work of the Multi-Partner Trust Fund in identifying programs of implementation, we have a much better sense of what GCM implementation could look like. Thirdly, there is shyness, that's been well documented, but I would not overstate that. We now have 14 champions of the GCM. I presume they'll be willing to speak out in favor of the GCM from all regions and all sub-regions in the world. The inputs to the forthcoming Secretary General's report out in December received, from my experience, an incredibly benefit from an incredibly positive response from member states and other partners. All regions are conducting reviews of the implementation of the GCM, including Europe, where I think many would have been skeptical as to whether this might have happened several months ago. And I think maybe, if I can comment on the report, it could have made perhaps something more of migration coming into the UN system, because I think for me, one of the great achievements of the Global Compact, beyond the objectives, are the states' commitment to following up and reviewing their implementation of this framework. And I would add alongside it the guiding principles of the compact, which are in many ways its DNA. These to me are the crowning achievements. The citing of the GCM is clearly a vexing issue for people. I would say it's important, but it is not existential. I think there I agree with John, and I think we need to become not too obsessed about, control F every document to see the extent to which the GCM is referenced. It is, to my mind, something of a red herring alongside that desiccated debate on whether or not the compact should have been legally binding. But I'm going to end, because I'm a gloomy Anglo-Saxon, with what I think the concerns are moving forward. Firstly, coming back to this crisis of confidence, we're still in the early chapters of the history of COVID-19. The worst is still to come in a whole range of ways, as I believe that confidence is going to be attacked, under assault, much more profoundly than I think we can yet anticipate. And even in the resolution of the pandemic, the arrival of the vaccine, I think that is going to present a huge number of challenges, particularly, but not exclusively, to the migration agenda. Secondly, I would beseech us all not to become too obsessed with process. I think we need to bed down the GCM take confidence that it is here, and continue to think of imaginative ways to continue to bring it to life. Thirdly, and perhaps this was somewhere I would amplify if the report undergoes a second edition, is, are we doing enough to reach out to all stakeholders? There was discussion on whether virtual or not virtual was an asset or not. I think that could have benefited from a further discussion on how we can truly reach out to all stakeholders beyond civil society. Again, one of the great achievements of the Compact was its long list of who were the relevant stakeholders who needed to be engaged, and I would query whether we're doing enough there. And then finally, I am extremely gratified to see in the revised agenda to this that there is a new session on complementarity. If we talk about the Global Compact coming out of a crisis, I think it's incumbent upon us to ask, well, to what extent we are, as an international system, equipped now to deal with the same types of crises in the future. I notice it's covered in John's report. I see it's a gap in the Refugee Compact report, and I'm looking forward to that discussion, the discussions ahead. Thank you very much. You're on mute, I think, or...
Jonathan, thank you very much for those comments. John, I'd like to bring you back in here. We hear Jonathan referring to a fourth dimension, in addition to the pandemic crisis, the economic crisis, and the protection crisis, a crisis of confidence. How does that resonate for you?
Well, I'm not confident enough to disagree with Jonathan, that's for sure. So I have my own little crisis there. Yeah, I think this gap in confidence is one we've seen. I'm going to say at least 7-10 years with respect to migration broadly, but very specifically also refugees and asylum seekers. I know that was how many in civil society characterized the central problematic in some of the movement in Europe, for example, against against even some hallmark, against words like refoulement in some of these international agreements, even in discussion and so on. Not across the continent, not across involving every country in Europe, but too many. And so this term crisis and confidence, yeah, I think it's there for sure. I think it's there probably among some of the stakeholders on that long list that Jonathan quite rightly referred to as needing to be more engaged. Are we among the non-state actors engaged confidently enough in our relationships with states and UN agencies and others, confident in our identity, many of us as migrants and refugees with increasing voice and place, confident in some emerging relationships with business and with mayors and the fresh energy there. So yeah, I agree. There's room for more confidence, that's for sure. And it will be challenged, as Jonathan says, even more this next year or two.
Thank you, John. John made reference here to non-state actors, and that is an excellent occasion to give the floor now to one of our participants from civil society. Colin Roger, I'm hoping that we are able to pop you on the screen with your intervention. Colin comes to us from the Civil Society Action Committee. Fingers crossed that we're able to unmute you and get you on. Colin, can you hear us?
I can.
Or question to John and/or Jonathan, please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Martha, and thank you, John and Jonathan, for your presentations, and John particularly for it's an excellent report again, and congratulations to MMC for that. Particularly a report that's very much data-driven, something we've come to really expect from MMC these days, and help us to really push the agenda and get an understanding of this. And John, I think we find ourselves in this sort of old analogy of glass half empty, glass half full situation when we look at this lack of confidence, and how do we see ourselves in whether in a state of action and not mention, as you pointed out, John. We're wondering if this is something, when you say looking at how its action is undertaken and then mention follows it. Are we a little bit over optimistic when we talk about that? Particularly those of us in civil society who've been applauding this, who have been uplifting these examples of different points of implementation of different objectives and different aspects of the compact. Are we being overconfident on our end in perhaps, overthinking and overemphasizing that this is actually showing that the compact is taking root? And take, for example, the great examples you give about the slew of regularizations, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, in response to that. In many countries that we highlighted and we applauded as good practices. In a recent webinar that we also organized on Objective 5 specifically on regular pathways, none other than Gervais Pave, longtime senior advisor at IOM, talked about Objective 5 as being a keystone objective. And you talked about how it does a spate of regularizations. And yet, when we look further beyond that, there are countries, even those that have signed on to the compact and were initial champions during the negotiations of compact, there are some countries where, regularization has gone the opposite way. There has been a crackdown on irregular migrants. There's a pushback on that. It partly is sort of this nationalistic response to the pandemic and kind of a misguided response. That's not a good sign as well. And when we look at regularization, how can we talk about, implementation of a compact that looks at much more long-term systematic implementation if we are just pointing to, quick actions being taken as sort of a sudden and immediate response needed to the crises, and not in terms of multilateral cooperation on that. Back to you.
Colin Raja of the Civil Society Action Committee, thank you very much. Jonathan, I'm going to turn to you first. What we hear is perhaps we too were overconfident in our expectations. What do you make of that notion?
I'm not sure I'm not overconfident about these things. I think it's always going to be a struggle. The birth of the GCM was not an easy process. I think there is an aspect of faking it until you make it in the setting up of any institutions. Frankly, I think the GCM as a document, as a framework, I think there was a characterization in John's report. He quoted someone as calling it a GPS, a global positioning system, which I very much like, is very much on track. I think there's a possibility of being self-absorbed. I mentioned this discourse and the disgruntlement around whether or not it was legally binding seemed to me to be entirely missing the point. I would even add to that, I think, some of the over-focus on issues around whether firewalls should or should not have been in there. We need to celebrate it even whilst being wide-eyed about its challenges. For me, the bigger issue is not whether the global compact is going to survive in the years ahead, but it's whether this whole fabric of multilateralism is going to be able to hold together, of which the GCM is a part. I think it will. But that's where I think we run the risk of potentially being overly confident.
Thank you, Jonathan. John, we're going to round off this session and move to refugees now, but I'm going to give you a last opportunity to respond. Confident, overconfident, not confident enough? What do you make of this?
Yeah, overconfident, no, I don't think so. I think I love Colin's word, optimism. I think many of us, certainly beginning with refugees and migrants, especially those forced to move, have a defiant kind of optimism of a kind, and I think we in among the non-state state actors, certainly we had defiant optimism when we walked into the negotiations, right from the New York Declaration on to the development of the two compacts. On regularization, yeah, I don't think that word is used not even once in the global compact. There's reference to regular pathways in here and there, but regularization of migrants already in the country, no, that's not referred to directly. and yet we're seeing these programs sprouting up in places more than a handful in COVID time. So for confidence, what builds confidence, what redeems confidence better than a solution that works? So the question for us who think regularization is not just a flash in the pan, not just maybe a temporary solution, but more real than that, it's up to us to show that's a solution that works, and that will build and redeem confidence.
John and Jonathan, thank you very much indeed for your contributions to this first round. We are hoping that you will stay with us and take part in our discussion towards the end also. But for now, we move from the Compact on Migration to the study that focuses on the Compact for Refugees. Restrictions of responsibility sharing, exploring the impact of COVID-19 on the Global Compact for Refugees. More specifically, is what we're going to hear now from Evan, Eastern Calabria. Evan is a senior research officer at the Refugee Studies Center at the University of Oxford and focuses on urban refugees, self-reliance and municipal responses. So like we did with the first study, we're going to ask Evan to present the key findings emerging, and then we're going to have a discussion, and then the floor will be open. And again, just to remind you, please keep your questions coming in the Q&A function, right-hand side panel of your screen. Evan, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you in spirit, in some form. It's actually been just wonderful listening and sort of realizing that some of what I'm sharing, I'd say a lot of what I'm sharing, really dovetails, builds on what has already been discussed, which is interesting considering that John and I had some great conversations, but didn't actually share that much about what we were finding as our research progressed. So over the last few months, I had the immense pleasure of speaking with over 55 people, members of the audience included, from a range of different sectors of society and UNHCR, other UN actors, international NGOs, civil society actors, refugee-led organizations, refugees themselves, and private sector actors and others. And I thought that I would use my time today to sort of share with you what I've been left with. So I've had about a month to sort of digest after writing the report. And I have just a few main takeaways that I think, again, really fit into our conversation thus far. So I have a brief PowerPoint that I will share here. This may be the most awkward part of this, if I can share it. There we go, I think we're up, okay. So I'd say my main summary of my findings is that, during COVID-19, the impact of COVID-19 on the Global Compact on Refugees, so GCR, is that it was pushed off the table in some ways, as one informant said, and also just the relevance of it made all the clearer. And I think these are both kind of key takeaways that, end in action and the need for further action. So as has already been discussed, the timing of the GCR, of the Global Refugee Forum, the GRF in December 2019 really matters. The timing of COVID mattered in terms of the newness of the compact. And timing still matters, looking ahead at kind of where we are with COVID and both of these compacts. There's a clear need to increase literacy and implementation on the GCR. So I'd say that there's a focus to really look at the action-oriented operational sides of the GCR. And when I was reflecting on that, I realized today, I was thinking, actually, I think all of it can be operationalized, right? It's a document that's meant to be lived. And so there's a lot to do in a very good way in terms of looking ahead with that. And in particular, there's a gap, I'd say, at the national and local levels, obviously in inverted commas, on kind of understanding what is the GCR and therefore what do we do with it. And then just clearly, we have an opportunity to make use of what we have, that we do have the GCR, and we need more leadership. We need more advocacy from a range of actors, leadership from a range of actors, more mainstreaming and implementation. So briefly diving into this, one informant, I'd say, put it quite bluntly and quite well, because we already have the GCR, the world doesn't have to go through that process again. And let's be honest, when we look around today, it probably wouldn't. We can all probably nod our heads at that statement. So really looking at this moment in time in the sense of the GCR being affirmed and there being some space for action to happen, for plans to be made before COVID happened. And then also, I'd say that the word marvel keeps coming to mind when I think about the timing, and not just, could the world have imagined what would have happened 1 year ago, but really just thinking about the Global Refugee Forum in particular, and trying to imagine, what would that have looked like as a Zoom event, for example, and really thinking that this happened at the very last minute. If it hadn't happened then, it might have been, a Zoom event or a super spreader event, who knows? And that's just important. And with this timing, there's bad news and good news. And I'd say half of me is an optimist and half is a cynic. So it's just very clear that because of the timing of the newness of the compact, the GCR and COVID, that not all of the GCR mechanisms were in place. And this means that I think it was less used, it was potentially less useful than it could have been. So for example, not all the support platforms were up and running. There was a sort of post-GRF digestion, we could say, of analyzing pledges, kind of figuring out what are the next steps, and that ended up coinciding with sort of the flurry of attention elsewhere that lockdowns and so on started. And I think that just leads to the very real risk of ongoing delays. And informants I spoke with were quite honest about, GRF pledges, for example, being delayed, and that being quite a consistent term that I heard. But also I'd say quite optimistic about the chance to make use of these pledges. And UNHCR has, I'd say, done a really good job in terms of accelerating some pledges, of recognizing what are the ones that are COVID-19 relevant and how could they get the support they deserve. I guess I've shifted into the good news, but I'd say going back to the bad news in the sense of, GCR being pushed off the table, I think, as John also said, there just hasn't been enough time for some of this mainstreaming and some of this implementation to happen. And that coincides with just time itself, right? So a lot of the informants I spoke with, I'd say, are, quite overburdened. And, one person said, we're firefighting, in an INGO, we're firefighting. And the GCR is important. I believe in the GCR, but I literally don't have space on my table. I've been trying to get these consultants out of Ataturk Airport, and that, that was my focus, and kind of thinking of the immediacy that I think many of us can relate to. But again, the good news in terms of some of the GRF pledges in particular being accelerated and used. And it was interesting hearing also informants talk about some of the themes of the GRF becoming more relevant in COVID-19. So several informants talked about kind of cash and some of the pledges around cash actually raising visibility in a really important way that made it easier to go to funders and say, we need to shift modalities, and that, we need to use cash. And that was kind of more on the table, as it were, than it might have been otherwise. And definitely localization as well. And the multi-stakeholder approach, this recognition that there's many people that need to be that are addressing these issues. And obviously, with everything disrupted, kind of the focus towards local actors and the incredible opportunities that brings for longer term change was apparent. And I'd also say with timing that the fact that, the GCR, however long ago all of this does seem, it was recent, and the GRF as well, and thinking about the investment that people made, the investment of time, of energy, and then the connections that were forged out of that. And I'd say that that's a real opportunity for kind of recognizing the momentum that was there and is still there in different forms. And some of the GRF briefings that UNHCR has held, the NGO weekly meetings, there's been some nice ways to maintain contact. And I think more of those efforts are needed, and probably for different areas, for the different objectives or the sub-working groups of the GRF and so on, in order to keep that going. But that's also, I'd say, built into the GCR in a really good way of thinking about regular stakeholder meetings and the GRF, as well as happening long-term every 4 years. So moving on to literacy and implementation, which I think can just be simplified to saying, we need more understanding of the GCR and we need more action. I went through hundreds of documents from NGOs, from UN statements and reports and so on, and there was very little messaging. So I'd say that was quite consistent with the GCM, was what John shared as well. with the GCR. And that, was reflected in interviews as well, of just the lack of mainstreaming. And I think that's, it kind of sounds vague and big, but dropping it down to saying, when people are in their day-to-day work, who are they calling on the phone? Do they have contact with the ministries of the government? Do they have contact with the civil society organizations, the refugee-led organizations, the refugees in the settlements, in the camps, in the urban areas? And how is that being integrated? And that's just one example of thinking about the time that's needed to do that, but also the importance of doing that, especially when there's disruptions in different ways. So I think this mainstreaming, this increasing literacy is important in terms of addressing COVID and secondary impacts today. So, thinking about the incredible need for inclusion of refugees in national systems, the multi-stakeholder approach being, as I just said, very relevant, just as two examples. Also looking ahead, John talked about kind of three crises that we're enveloped in, and I'd say, we have a looming crisis, and it's our context of thinking about global warming and the climate crisis, and what will that do with displacement. So thinking about, having the GCR fit for purpose in the sense of being integrated, implemented, mainstreamed, however we want to say that, for the next crises, really, in plural. And just to note that, I'd say this is a kind of symbolic or representative of a gap in understanding and action of some disconnects between international and national local levels, where some members of organizations sitting in Geneva had a ton to say about the GCR, and other people, I felt bad for taking up their time because of everything else they were doing in their office in major refugee hosting countries, for example. And also a gap between policy and practice that I think more action plans, more statements. I do think it's important to be including mentions and discussions of the GCR in policy briefs, in advocacy documents. I think there's a lot there that we do need to be making use of, and that's one way. And as an international agency informant said as a recommendation, most important is that it does get anchored in what countries are doing. An internal UNHCR uptake, I would say all organizational uptake to the extent that it's relevant, and it should be relevant. So ending with that, of this really making use of what we have, there was, I'd say, really positive belief in the GCR. And as I continued this research, I started believing in it more, and it stopped being kind of a document, and it sort of became more alive in really important ways. And there's a lot of potential. And when we look at what's in there, what could be more important today in terms of looking at the need for more equitable responsibility sharing. And that means access to asylum. That means, funding major refugee hosting countries. It means, increasing resettlement, protection and solutions of, the immediate support, and then really keeping an eye on what's ahead and the solutions that refugees need in various ways. A really important development in humanitarian approach, again, kind of looking at what's needed now, and then in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, the worst is yet to come, as Jonathan told us, what will be needed. And I think the multi-stakeholder approach is clear. And this little Scrabble board picture, we could say it's, very kitschy, but I think it's also just that reminder of, the GCR is a tool, and it's a tool that we should be using to support people, to help people. And we need to make sure that it's not something that was affirmed, that there were pats on the back or pledges made without more coming out of it, because there's a lot to do. And just ending with one of my informants' quotes, who said, we put 2 years into this, who was, at the policy table, into determining the language and fighting for the inclusion of issues. It was an enormous amount of effort. Now we have to use it. I'd say that's the message of the day. So I will pass it back to the moderators now. Thank you very much.
Evan, thank you very much for that outline, that tour de force. Lots of questions that we could ask you, including from the Q&A panel. There's one specific one which is quickly over and done with, and that is, where is the report available? The answer is the website of the Danish Refugee Council, drc.dk is where you can find it. We'll get back to a number of those questions that you have raised, and you can still raise more. But I want to bring in the discussant, Grain O'Hara, at this point. Grain comes to us from UNHCR, where she is director of the Division for International Protection She's worked more than 20 years with the UNHCR, so it's very familiar with the area. So let's hear from you, your feedback on the presentation of findings from Evan. The floor is yours.
Or down.
You are now unmuted and we can hear you. Pleased to have you with us. The floor is yours.
You can hear me. Excellent. So I keep my eye on you. At the same time, I press a button here in front of me on the stopwatch that tells me, controls my time, because anyone who knows me knows I can be a big talker. But do that earlier signal. If I'm going over time, do that chopping signal so I know it's time to stop. Thank you very much for inviting us. We're very pleased to have this opportunity to be engaged in the discussion today. We're very pleased that DRC and the MMC took up the mantle of taking on this research. We find that it's helpful for us to reflect on the value of these two sister compacts, which indeed many of us have invested a lot of time and energy in, not only over the last 2 years, but over several decades, because they didn't spring from nothing. A lot of groundwork went on before the compacts were framed in the context of compacts. A lot of work done in the different committees of the UN in New York and many other fora, our XCOM. So a lot of work has gone into this. I would also like to thank Evan for her presentation, particularly the slides she just flashed up for us. And I'd love to get them because in many ways, and like Jonathan, I'm not going to use the time available to me as, you know, I'm not going to pick apart the research that was done and start counter-arguing, because I think we should take the research for what it is and we should draw out from it the voices of the wide range of stakeholders that were involved. At the same time, I have to say that in the slides and the way Evan drew out her main themes, I found it more balanced and comprehensive in some ways in the way she framed it and presented it than some of the actual report itself. So I'd love to get my hands on those slides. For us, in terms of, you know, looking at the GCR, and Jonathan has already made several comments which I think are equally relevant, and I very much subscribe to 2 points that he raised. Number one, let's not focus on like the mentions as if this was a word count game, because there are many different ways the GCR can be mentioned. Can be through how we push the pledges, how we operationalize the pledges, how we frame the forum, the discussions that took place just last week here in Geneva in our executive committee, where not a single state missed the opportunity to talk about both the compact and the forum. So I think that this mentions issue, I'm not saying that we should not be vocal and we should not use the frameworks we work so hard to develop, but I don't think necessarily we have to put the trademark of Global Compact on refugees into every statement we make. On that, just a reflection at the very outset of the COVID crisis, our High Commissioner made a strategic decision that in his public outreach to governments, to faith organizations, to NGOs, and in some of the early public advocacy, he made a deliberate decision, and this may seem counterintuitive, but he decided that he would not, in fact, frame everything in terms of refugees and the compact, because he felt it was very important in dealing with the crisis on such a global scale that we not all try to trademark from our specific mandate, but that we look at the bigger picture of inclusion. And the message that he used repeatedly was one of inclusion, and he didn't necessarily feel compelled to frame that always in the compact. And that was a strategic messaging discussion he took. So I think we also need to reflect on that sometimes mentions are good, sometimes excessive mentions can be polarizing, and you have to deliver messages depending on your audience and the context and the issues with which you want your audience to focus on. What I like very much about how Evan has just framed things now in her brief presentation was to focus on the action. And for us, focusing on the action is not so much about always having a narrow focus on the compact itself, but looking at the compact in the focus of its bigger environment, which means it's linked to the convention, it's linked to other elements of international refugee law, its operationalization through the forum and the resulting pledges, and where you see the action in very real terms, which also reflects the very legitimate focus on localization, where you see the action in real terms is in the operationalization of individual pledges at country and regional level. And I would have liked to have seen more acknowledgement and reflection on that, because I couldn't help but shake the impression throughout reading the report that, unlike how Ivan has just framed it now, that it was missing that broader context, that it was too narrowly conceptualized only on the compact and not looking at all the things that relate to the compact, of which for us really the action and the localization issues, you've got to look through the lens of the forum and the pledges, because honestly that is where the action is. We appreciated the reflection of what worked well and where you could see that the compact or other tools that the compact was the triggering catalyst came to the fore in responding to the COVID crisis. We found it good that some positive examples were drawn out. Of course, it's easy to become overwhelmed by the negative examples, and one of the big negative examples, whether you're talking about refugees or whether you're talking about migrants, was that by definition, one of the reactions to the pandemic was an immediate closure of borders. And by very definition, that clamps down on mobility, on access to asylum, on resettlement, on voluntary repatriation. But amidst that, that big global characteristic, we have many, many positive examples at country and regional level, how we quickly managed to overcome the impediment of closed borders. Many examples of how we were able to have admission procedures accompanied by UNHCR and a wide range of other stakeholders and partners putting in place the quarantine arrangements that states needed to be confident enough to say to their public, we are still admitting refugees and we're doing it in a way that safeguards fully all of the public health requirements that you are so rightly concerned about. And I think we can draw out a lot more of those positive examples, and they are going to give us the building blocks, the foundations to maintain momentum in what might otherwise seem a very daunting and a huge step backwards against the momentum that surrounded the adoption of the compact and the move into the forum and the pledges. So I would like to encourage us all to look a lot more at those positive examples and see how we move forward with them. And I will not belabor the point here or take up more time on it, because there are many documents that we can look at and a lot more information on our website. I guess from your body language, you're probably moving close to the chopping, so I will stop before I get chopped. Back to you.
Great, thank you very much indeed. You have an astute ability to read body language. My compliments. And thank you for those points from UNHCR perspective. Evan, can I go back to you? And there are some very specific questions. Will your presentation be available? You can quickly respond to that. But also, if you could respond to the point brought forward by Grain on the perspective of your study. Is it in some ways too narrow on the compact? Could it also have included localization and the broader forum pledges? Evan, please.
Great. Thank you very much for those reflections. Deeply appreciated. I'm happy to make this presentation available. We'll figure out how. We can keep you updated. Yeah, I appreciate that point. I'd say on one hand, part of the study might be reflected in my researcher mentality in terms of really trying to pull apart the GCR as kind of a document that again kind of gives life to all of these different mechanisms and arrangements and thinking through. And there's enough there to do a much longer study on, for sure. And so I'd say in some ways I approached it quite focused in trying to understand what was seen and what was understood kind of with the GCR as the lens. I guess that seemed important. And I really appreciate that point of thinking about, if it's inclusion, does it matter if we're talking about the GCR or not? And it's something that I thought about a lot. And I started actually asking people as I continued the interviews, because it was something I actually grapple with in terms of thinking about the relevance. And are we saying, what's in the GCR is the most relevant, which I would agree with. But if we're thinking as well as the GCR as a tool, as an instrument, however, as a compact, an agreement, we can use lots of words for it, but as something that's supposed to help guide us to these as well, I think it's also important to make use of it as kind of a document. I wish I had a copy so I could hold it up in my hand right now. I think there is kind of this sort of sticky, intangible relationship, right, between language and, in practice, and, read Foucault to get a sense of that, right? That I think I guess people, maybe just briefly to share, I'd say people had some different reflections. So some people said, it doesn't matter. We just want to make sure that refugees are getting access to national, inclusion or, national systems. And others said, along the lines of, we really fought to have this language because it's going to help us. And so I think in some ways it's also a way of signaling what is there that actually can be more useful. And, fair and equitable responsibility and burden sharing, just as a term, right? I think that's something useful that we could be using more. And I say we very expansively here. And at the same time, it's also, I think there is a risk of, if it becomes too diffuse, if it is just localization or just repatriation, if we're sort of going into these other areas, there's a risk then that what is in the GCR just, again, isn't as utilized as it could be. So I agree, and both and.
Evan, thank you very much indeed, and thank you also to Grain again for the discussant point. We have one more speaker whose perspective I'd like to bring in before we move into a final discussion, and that's Wies Maas. Wies is coordinator of international programs at the Dutch Council for Refugees, and Wies has agreed to talk to us about the complementarity of the two compacts and how she sees these two studies coming together and informing us on the issue of migrants and refugees, which sometimes in the real world can be a little bit tricky to keep completely apart. So with these words of introduction, Wies, we're very pleased to have you with us also. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Werner, for those kind words of introductions, and thank you for the invitation to speak at this webinar. I have the rather daunting task to spend 5 minutes on talking about the complementarity between the whole world of refugees and the whole world of migrants in the context of COVID and the compacts. That's a daunting task, but I'm actually quite glad that all of the speakers so far, and also both of the reports, already touch upon the complementarity of the both compacts and where issues of refugees and refugee protection and migrant protection basically merge, overlap, but also sometimes underlap. And in that regard, I should also say that your work as the Danish Refugee Council and the Mixed Migration Center, of course, is a case in point of where the compacts are complementary, and I congratulate you on that work. And if I may start with one recommendation follow-up of this webinar, what I would love to see, even though I'm mindful that someone said, oh, what we really don't need is another paper, I would love to see some paper coming out of this webinar that actually draws out a couple of these examples of where the issues of migrants and refugees overlap in practice when we talk about the COVID response. We've heard a couple of examples. I'm going to give a couple of examples during my intervention, but I think it would be great to have some of that on paper to actually use in our advocacy work towards our national governments. And that's where I want to start talking from my own position. I've had the benefit or the disadvantage of having worked at the global level for quite some time, having been part of the negotiations for some time, and then I completely moved and shifted to the local level looking at refugee protection here in the Netherlands and also working with European partners. And I was struck by one of the comments in the report that was quite gloomy, saying that the compacts were kind of irrelevant in the European context, that they're not really being used or referred to. Of course, they are a little bit toxic, at least the compacts on migration, but just generally that they aren't really seen or used so much in policy discussions. And also, I should look at myself in our own advocacy work. And this made me a bit gloomy because we've worked on these compacts so hard. And yet at the same time, almost all the speakers have referred to the fact that perhaps it's much more important to focus on action, and it doesn't matter all that much whether the compacts are referenced or not. I tend to only half agree with that. I do think these frameworks are there to be used, but what I find more important, they're there to be used to show what action is being taken. And we've heard plenty of examples on regularization, on stopping certain detention, on access to national services, health services, where the compacts may or may not have informed, but at least where there have been new actions by governments. But what I really want to emphasize and spotlight is where I think we really should use the compact is there where there has been no action at all, but even more importantly, where there has been anti-action against the compacts. And I think the compacts are, in that sense, still a great framework for advocacy to show that governments have committed to certain things that they are not doing. And the one pertinent issue that we've been working on a lot the last year, and that's quite visible, obviously, is the issue of border violence and pushbacks. Clearly in the compacts and in all kinds of human rights frameworks that have been agreed priorly, this is against what governments have said they would do. And yet this is a trend that we see across the board. I mean, it's happening in Europe in many countries, but it's also happening in other countries. So I do think that the global compacts are also quite useful to spotlight not only the positive story where governments have been taking action, the champion states, but also to show where there's really anti-action going on against what has been agreed in the compacts. So I've been asked to draw out a couple of commonalities between the two compacts as it relates to the COVID response and as it has come out of in both reports of John and Evan. And I think there are two quite obvious commonalities, and one is what all presentations have referred to, is that the pandemic that we find ourselves in poses to both compacts, to the implementation, particularly to the lives of refugees and migrants, an existential threat. And it's not only sort of directly when we look at border closures or quite immediate job losses, which pertains both to refugee workers and migrant workers, but it's also more globally, the worst is yet to come, as Jonathan says. What is going to be the economic and global geopolitical impact of this pandemic? And I think there's a huge risk of all of us as organizations, but also particularly governments, turning inward, looking at our own interest and not seeing those global compacts as relevant frameworks anymore. So yes, there's an existential threat coming towards both compacts because of the pandemic. And at the same time, I think both reports have alluded to that the pandemic also poses a great opportunity to mainstream refugees and migrants much more quickly than we maybe would have thought in certain policy areas and systems. And I think the one area that has come out most clearly of both reports is definitely health systems. So we've seen in many countries that much more quickly than we would have probably foreseen, migrants and refugees and asylum seekers have been mainstreamed into certain national health systems, have had access to national health care. But there are a couple of other national social service provisions where we also can see that trend. So that's I think, a clear commonality. And then I think the third commonality that both John and Evan and the other speakers have drawn out quite clearly is that somehow COVID is a stress test for whether the compacts are a useful framework in times of crisis, and this stress test came too early. It kind of feels that the systems weren't ready to use the compacts really immediately and practically when we had to respond to the pandemic being hit. And then obviously the fourth commonality between the compacts is the effect that the pandemic has on the real life of refugees and migrants. When we talk about losses of jobs, losses of livelihood, working in the informal sector, but also increases in domestic violence, or maybe even opportunities for family reunification, that across the board for refugees who were in this process, but also for migrants, has been halted. So in the real life, there's a lot of interactions between the compacts. I shouldn't talk for too long because there should be some time for discussion. I want to give one example from the Netherlands where we felt that the government of the Netherlands wasn't ready, and yet the compact did have a great impact. And this is a super practical example where the pandemic first hit and the first measures were taken by the government that were just as relevant for the refugees and migrants and asylum seekers that were in the country, but all the measures that were taken were communicated in Dutch. So there was a lot of confusion among those asylum seekers still in the centers, but also refugees. What was going on? Were kids allowed to go to school? How would you have access to healthcare? And there was no system, no thinking that information should be provided in more languages in times of a crisis. But what happened is that a group of refugee-led and migrant-led initiatives in the Netherlands, who had been very engaged during the negotiations of the compact, actually immediately stepped up and formed a help desk for refugees and migrants to ask questions in their respective languages. So it was a very practical example that I don't think would have taken off if the compact wouldn't have happened and if these groups wouldn't have been organized in the Netherlands. But it was also a very clear example of where, at least in our case, in the Dutch government, we were not ready to respond to a pandemic. I can go on and on. I won't do that. Just to conclude my intervention, I just want to echo one thing that I think John said it in those words. And when I look at myself and my organization, I do think there is a burden, or let's say a responsibility upon us to wave the flag much more visibly of the compacts, to spotlight the actions that are taken. But again, what I said in the beginning, I also really think we should use the compact to call out on governments on the things that they're not doing, that are going against the spirit of the compacts. So having that said, I pass over the floor back to you, Werner, and thank you very much.
Lise, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for those points. Thank you for trying to pull in some of the points raised by previous speakers. That's always very helpful. I'd like to try and bring in a few of the observations from our participants who have written in the Q&A. And I'd like if you could refer a little bit more to this waving the flag more vividly and what exactly we mean. I mean, what is it that we need to do to keep up momentum on these two compacts? For instance, one participant wishes to know how can we be confident to work with people's elected members of parliament more, and can we make sure that this compact is not only discussed globally but also at regional and national level? So I don't know, Lise, if you'd like to respond to this first, and the floor is open for other participants as well, but if you'd like to start us off, Lise.
Yeah, I actually think I'm the least placed among the panelists to respond to this question, so I would gladly pass over the floor. But I can give you one quick example where I felt we haven't done our job of using the compact the way we should. And so in Europe, we, among other organizations, have been working a lot on getting European governments to agree to better solidarity and responsibility sharing mechanisms. Generally, more resettlement, more relocation, but very specifically, from the moment the pandemic hit, we've been advocating for immediate relocation and deconstitution from the Greek island, the Greek refugee camps. We advocated before the pandemic on that, but when the pandemic hit, this was a really important point for us. We didn't think to refer to the compact as the reference framework for responsibility and solidarity sharing. So there was a shyness from our side as the Dutch Council, but also as other civil society organizations, to use this as a reference point, saying to governments, you've agreed to more responsibility and solidarity sharing. Here's a case in point where there's immediate action needed, where a government is actually asking for solidarity and we're not doing it. So that's what I mean with waving the flag, even in our own advocacy in our own projects, in our own work. But as said, I do think I'm the least placed sort of generally globally to comment on this. So I'll be quiet now and pass over the floor to other speakers.
Thank you very much. And just also to acknowledge your recommendation on a follow-up paper trying to put together the complementarity of the two studies. I think that's an idea that holds a lot of promise. Before time runs out, I'd like to bring in one last voice from outside, Nicholas Faith-Tan, who's a researcher at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. I'm hoping now we have you with us, Nick, and that you are able to summarize your observations and perhaps your questions in just a minute or two. Nick, please. Nick, can you hear us? Hello? It doesn't seem to be the case, but we have Grain waving her hand. So we go back to Grain, UNHCR. You'd like to make a comment, so please.
Okay, now you are muted.
Thank you so much. And I will be very quick because you've indulged me. Look, as UNHCR, we would never discourage any well-intentioned partner from flying the flag of the compact. I very much encourage that. When it comes, however, to regional or country-specific engagement, I would encourage people to move away from the compact as one big monolith, which can be viewed sometimes as overly conceptual. And when you're digging in action-oriented at regional or country level, take the part of the compact that's most relevant to the issue and the audience you're working with. The 3 regional platforms on solutions, for example, are an excellent way to have the compact as your chapeau, but you're using a message which is much more tailored to the local audience. Thank you. Back to you.
Very much, Grain, for that point, which also touches upon a comment from another participant who stresses that there is the European Pact for Migration to take into consideration, and that's just in line with what you brought out. There's a question for Evan from one of our participants, and the question reads, what recommendations do you have for UNHCR and NGOs to make sure that the Global Compact for Refugees is anchored in country level accountability mechanisms? How do we bridge the gap between the global and national accountability? Evan, would you like to respond to that question from one of our participants, please?
Sure. Well, very quickly, I'd say it became clear just from talking with people within UNHCR, in UNHCR country offices and INGOs country offices and so on, that I think, and this sounds kind of like subpar, but more conversations need to happen, and really just building on this previous point of sort of what is the most relevant in piece of the compact at this time, in this context, and so on, that really can be built on. And I think there needs to be kind of what I was trying to get at with more literacy of understanding of what's relevant in order to really use it. And some of that just has to be understanding kind of what's there, and then kind of going off of the previous point, sort of what else is there, who else is in the room, who else is in the city, the settlement, and so on. So I'd say we've seen some good examples of action plans, and in Kenya, in a refugee camp, the KISDEP action plan for the Kakuma settlements is one example, or Kakuma camps. And there being ways that really dropping down to a more granular level in terms of thinking through different actors and actions. And yeah, I guess one example, and I didn't bring it into the report, is actually of Sao Paulo in Brazil. And so they have, and I'm going to butcher this, I was just going through my notes trying to find it. They have just released some sort of city plan, and this isn't the correct title, that on migrants, which they include refugees within that. So there's one point of sort of looking at, refugees are migrants. What is the protection everyone's getting? What's the special protection refugees are getting? But really from a municipal perspective, how does the GCR guide these city plans? And so it's this section of it is very much aligned with the GCR. So some of that really kind of granular thinking of step by step, what's the most relevant kind of pieces, as we just heard, for different contexts. And yeah, I think some of that really is just conversations. And I would say that that's also, just briefly, something I really question throughout the research too, of how do we make change, right? How do we use things? Does it happen behind closed doors? Does it happen in advocacy documents? And I think for me, the answer is it's everywhere, right? We have to use kind of the channels we have. I'll end there.
I think with this note of using the channels we have, we end on a constructive note, not because we have exhausted the topic or reached answers to all our questions about how to keep up momentum and how to keep responding to the acute needs of the here and now, as well as the longer term challenges, but because time simply has run out and not been our friend. Technology has been sort of our friend. I mean, we were not able to get through to Nick Tan, unfortunately. We hope you'll join us next time. And when I say next time, it's because this is part of a series of webinars that the Danish Refugee Council is hosting on the consequences of COVID-19 on displacement affected populations. You can find updates on both of these, both of the websites of the Mixed Migration Center and the DRC. And God willing, also with the presentations that Evan at least declared her willingness to make available. That's also where you would be able to find more information on events coming up. For now, thank you all very much indeed. Special thanks to our panelists. Apologies for not having more time to bring them back into our conversation. But for now, thank you all very much indeed, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you, Werner. Great hosting.
Thank you very much. Good job, Weiss.
Bye. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, all. Bye-bye.
Are we off?